Welcome to the Retinoid Revolution webinar brought to you by Covelo, one of the largest ingredient databases to give you supplier information, and it's free if you'd like to sign up. My name's Jen, and I'll be moderating this discussion about, again, retinoids. And with me today is Lalita Iyer, who is a cosmetic chemist with experience in formulating, regulatory, and product development. Lalita loves to innovate new skincare products and has worked with some of the leading skincare brands in the beauty industry. Dr. Aegean Chan is a double board certified dermatologist and dermatopathologist. Dr. Chan has performed extensive laboratory research on the science of the skin barrier, and her clinical expertise is focused on complex medical dermatology. And last but not least, we have Ralph Spindler, who is the technical director for Health and Beauty Solutions, a company that develops ingredients and finished products for the personal care market, with a focus on retinoids. He has been working on the delivery of active ingredients for more than 30 years. So we have someone from the practitioner side of things, Aegean, someone from the formulating perspective, Lalita, and then someone from the ingredient development side of things. And so I guess I'll just get started with my first question. And initially I'll direct this to Ralph. So what are retinoids? And then what's the diversity of retinoids out there?
Yeah, so retinoids are molecules that you find really throughout the whole body, and they're really important to a lot of biological responses that the skin needs. But within the retinols that we're talking about here are really kind of things like retinol, which is vitamin A, which everyone knows because it's vitamin A, so a vitamin that's used for nutrition. The real active form of the molecule in the skin is retinoic acid. And so the retinoic acid is the one that really does all the work in the skin to be able to help repair the skin and make it stronger. Of the other types of molecules, retinaldehyde is another molecule that's in this family as well. And then one that people know about is retinol palmitate, which is often used as an ingredient that's going to be used in nutritional cases, but really is not terribly effective in the skin, but has been used in a lot of skin care products as well. So that's kind of the broad overview of what the retinoids are. There's sort of second and third generations that have been used mostly in pharmaceutical applications, but not so much in skincare applications.
And then maybe I'll add on to this question and then flip it to Aegean. So what are some of the prescription and non-prescription retinoids out there? And then what are the functions of action? What can we expect from these retinoids?
So it can get a little bit confusing, but I always like to kind of think of the term retinoids as an umbrella term. And then retinol, retinal, retinol esters, so like retinol palmitate, those are all the over-the-counter kind of cosmeceutical type ingredients that are used for products that you don't need a prescription for. And then in terms of prescription retinoids, tretinoin is our gold standard. And then that is the topical isoform of isotretinoin. So what was formerly known as Accutane, the oral form that we use to treat predominantly acne, but a few other diseases as well. And then there's second generation, which Ralph had mentioned. So adapalene, also known as Differin commercially, that was formerly prescription only and has been released as an OTC drug, which has been wonderful for acne patients. And those are pretty much the main ones. There's tazarotene and bexarotene that are also used for other diseases that are prescription only. And really, you know, in terms of retinoids as a whole, you can kind of think as the retinoic acid as the train conductor. It can get right into the nucleus and it can affect a lot of cellular activities. So in terms of the activities it exerts on keratinocytes, so skin cells themselves, it helps control proliferation, cell division. It can also affect collagen production. So that's why it's so useful in treating photo damage and skin laxity. It increases collagen, it helps boost elastin fiber production. And those are kind of longer term effects that you can see. And then in terms of acne, this is how I explain it to my patients, kind of makes your skin cells less sticky. It regulates how they divide, so they're less likely to clog up your pores and lead to breakouts. But it's not a spot treatment. I think that's a big kind of misconception that people have, that it actually kind of resets your skin production machinery to make you less likely to break out. So that's kind of an overview of predominantly what we use retinoids for: photo damage, as well as acne and other acneiform type diseases.
Now, would it be safe to say that retinol, and I suppose retinal as a newer ingredient available, are kind of the gold standard for actives in cosmetics? Some of the actives used in cosmetics with more research to support them. Would that be a safe assumption or statement? Would you agree with that statement?
I agree with that statement. I still think there's a long way to go. And I think I was kind of looking into the research preparing for this session. And really, the clinical studies that we have comparing the two are not great. They're about, groups of patients, about 20 people, and they're not totally controlled. The recent one by Zoe Draelos, it compared I think it was a retinal cosmetic type product with prescription tretinoin, but they also use different moisturizers. There are other ingredients in the over-the-counter product. So it's not quite a direct comparison. I would love to see same vehicle, but just different active, and compare tolerability and efficacy. But it kind of looks like the data is showing that you can really get pretty equivalent results with tretinoin versus retinol and retinal, but the tolerability is definitely better with the cosmetic retinol and retinal formulations.
Okay, so there's clearly a lot to unpack on that specific question,
Yes.
but we will put a pin in it. And then if anyone in the comments has questions about what we were just talking about, or questions just in general, I see you guys are quite active in the comments, then leave it in the comments, and then there will be time for a Q&A towards the end. So my next question, and I'll start with Lalita first for this question. What are some of the misconceptions you hear related to retinoids?
Yeah, I think when it comes to retinoids, we've seen so many different types of misconceptions. And, a lot of them have to do with the safety of retinoids. And I really do feel like a lot of what the whole, misconceptions is more so on what we read on the internet than kind of in real life. But, that being said, a common question that I frequently get is, can retinols be used with alpha hydroxy acids, and is that safe, and is that gonna like disrupt my skin barrier, etc. And a lot of it, as a formulator, I can say it really comes down to the formulation and how it suits your specific skin type. I mean, there's a study that shows that a 0.1% of retinaldehyde with, I believe it was like a 6% glycolic acid in a product really showed nice results, because the glycolic acid actually helped penetrate the retinaldehyde, and people seem to love this product. It's from quite a famous brand, and so that just goes to show that in a formulation, when you have an alpha hydroxy acid as well as a retinoid, it can play nicely, right? But again, that really comes to your own skin type. Perhaps some people may find that could be irritating. That's totally fine, especially if you have acne prone or sensitive skin types. That makes sense. Maybe a retinol and a glycolic acid, or retinaldehyde and glycolic acid, whether it's in a product together or you layer it on top of each other, might not suit your skin, and that's okay. And so I think it really comes down to formulation. That's what I always tell everyone. There's no such thing as, is this going to work or is this not going to work? Because, that varies depending on your skin type. But I think so. One of the biggest misconceptions that I've personally seen is, can you use retinols with other acids? And my answer to that is, it depends. Yes to some, no if you can't tolerate it.
One thing I think you do have to watch out for when you're formulating with retinols is that if you go too low in pH, you can destroy the retinol products. And so you really do have to watch that to make sure that you're going to put it in a formulation that's going to work. Or like you said, if the proper formulation is developed. We've developed some products where we had a water and oil emulsion, and we're able to keep retinol with low pH salicylic acid or glycolic acid, for example, just because they were able to be protected because of the delivery system technology that we were using and how it was formulated. So it's absolutely right. You got to be really careful and understand what you do when you're formulating with these molecules so you can make sure that the consumer gets the benefit that they're really looking for.
And I feel like we've come so far in formulation technology that we understand that, you know, you can use retinols now, like their formulation. Of course, Ralph, you can go into this later, but encapsulation is such an amazing technology to really protect the retinoid, not only from helping you with the irritation potential, but also just, you know, it helps from the susceptibility to degradation. So you have, you know, so that helps as well. So I think, you know, we've come really far with formulation technology and understanding that we know that pH has to be optimal, you know, and doing the correct stability testing as well on that product to ensure that it sustains, that the integrity of the product is intact in different storage conditions. And that is something that most brands and manufacturers already do, but it's just something that, you know, it's just that important step in ensuring that a product is also stable.
Aegean, would you like to add on? And perhaps you can just quickly address this question that came up in the chat, but it's relevant here. That, well, the question was, is a natural retinol or retinoid like Bakuchiol? Oh, wow, I never realized I can't say that word. Effective too? Perhaps you could say the word if you know how to say it. And also, is that a retinoid? What's going on with that? Okay, what's going on with that?
It is not a retinoid. It is not a retinoid molecule. And I think there's been a lot of marketing around it by saying it's the natural alternative, but it's a completely different molecule. It may have some kind of overlapping activity where you can have some kind of similar results. I mean, I think it's such a new ingredient. I haven't seen a ton of data on it. I think there's more hype than there is kind of data to back it up, but I think it's an interesting concept. I don't generally recommend that to my patients quite yet. I'm not so compelled by what I've seen. So I would probably, as a clinician, I stick to what I've seen data on, and that's what I base my recommendations for my patients, as well as what I kind of talk about on my social media channels as well. But kind of diving back to misconceptions for retinoids, I think there's a lot of retinoid clinical misconceptions. So I definitely agree with Lalita and Ralph that you can use a retinoid with a AHA product. What I've seen is that people will reach for like the ordinary purple peel and try to pair that with a tretinoin. And that is just kind of a recipe for disaster. I see people coming in with irritant reactions to things like that. I agree that if it's formulated correctly and properly tested, that most people can probably tolerate it if they don't have, you know, otherwise sensitive skin. It really depends. I usually have people, if they're going to use separate products, and use kind of a higher percentage acid product to stagger the nights. Some people will use them together, but again, if you can tolerate it, that's fine. And I think with a lot of things, especially on the internet, things can be very black and white, but it really depends on the person and what works for you. And so there's a lot of trial and error, especially when it comes to retinoids. And so I think there's a lot of fear around retinoids. So I've heard a lot, oh, doesn't it thin the skins? It's bad for you. Well, it doesn't thin the skin. It does cause initial exfoliation of the top layer of the skin, the stratum corneum, but over time, it actually causes epidermal acanthosis, epidermal thickening. It's not really photosensitive. It doesn't make you photosensitive. There's some studies that have looked at the amount of UV that your skin needs to have a burn, and using a retinoid does not decrease that number. But there is a significant learning curve, and I think that's less with a lot of the cosmetically formulated products that are encapsulated, that are using kind of the retinol esters, retinal, definitely much more gentle on the skin. But there's this perception that it's this very complicated thing to use, and I think that retinoids do require some counseling and education along with that product. So when I prescribe tretinoin for my patients, it always comes with a handout, and I give them, a 5-minute spiel on how to use it, how to build up, use it every other night, make sure you're using a moisturizer, watch out for dryness and irritation. So there's a lot of counseling that should go with it if somebody wants to use it successfully. And then the other piece, I think, is that there's this perception they don't work. I think maybe there are some people that use it for a really short amount of time. I would say 2 weeks is usually when people give up on it. So one of the first things I tell people is you have to use it for at least 6 to 8 weeks to see any appreciable difference in your acne or whatever other concerns you're trying to address. Sun damage even longer, at least 3 months. So I think that's a really big misconception, and that kind of spreads. Oh, they don't work. I've used it before, they don't work. So I always have to convince patients, well, use these methods, and you will see results if you stick with it. But again, I think it's really, you need that education piece along with it.
So in there, I know you did kind of touch on this, but just to clarify, so can you use retinoids in the summer when it maybe is more sunny? That's the first question. The other thing that I hear quite often on social media is people are afraid to use retinoid products topically, which obviously there's a difference between internal prescriptions and topical prescriptions, and also prescriptions for cosmetics. But people are afraid to use these products when they're breastfeeding or when they're pregnant. So what's going on there? What should people know with respect to using these products when they are pregnant or breastfeeding?
So in terms of retinoids in the summer, I tell my patients you can continue using them. Use your sunscreen. As with anything in the summer, I think there may be kind of this perception that maybe you're a little bit more photosensitive on them, but I also think that the UV index is higher in the summer. People's behaviors are different in the summer, but I haven't seen any data that supports the idea that retinoid topically makes you more photosensitive. Oral does make you more photosensitive, definitely. So my patients that are on isotretinoin, I do counsel them on, using more sun protective measures in that case. And then in terms of the questions around breastfeeding and pregnancy, so the reason why as dermatologists, we do not recommend use of any form of retinoid during pregnancy is because there are known birth defects with the oral form of it. That's why Accutane in the US is regulated by the government, and it's a regulated substance essentially because of that risk. However, there isn't that much data to support fetal abnormalities with the use of topical, especially on a limited area like your face. But because of that theoretical potential, that's why during pregnancy, I don't think any dermatologist tells their patients that they can continue using their retinoids. But it is less than 1% absorption. I guess depending also on the formulation and what type of molecule you're using, definitely something like tazarotene is going to absorb more than something like a retinol. But in terms of breastfeeding, there's a great resource by PubMed called LactMed. So that's a great resource for anybody that's lactating to kind of look and see what medications they're using and see what data is out there. So the guidance is really not clear. There's not clear labeling on what's breastfeeding safe and what's not. There's a lot of kind of mommy blogs around there saying you cannot use retinoids while breastfeeding. And I think what's happening is that people are just kind of transposing what you weren't supposed to do during pregnancy, during breastfeeding as well. But, it is a completely different stage of life. That baby is out of your body and growing and developing, and their organs are pretty much fully formed. So the concerns of cardiac abnormalities and other fetal defects that you had with tretinoin during pregnancy, you don't have those concerns anymore. And really, because there's such little absorption, if you're using it on a limited area, you're only using it on your face, it's very unlikely that they're really even getting anything through the breast milk. So I tell my patients, based on the data that we have, it looks like it is safe to use during breastfeeding. There's even less, so most of the data is on tretinoin itself, and less so on retinols and retinals. But I believe that the absorption is even less for those molecules. But Ralph and Lalita, you can correct me if I'm wrong.
Dr. Chan, I actually have a question for you because some of the brands
Yes.
that I'm working with right now are using Bakuchiol serum. And so the one question that comes up over and over again is that, can you actually claim for sure that Bakuchiol is safe in pregnancy? Can you make that statement on your packaging, on your social media with confidence? And I think that's something I hesitate, and I generally, my advice is no, but I've seen a lot of conflicting information online saying, yes, you can, or no, you shouldn't, because technically we don't have, the studies on Bakuchiol are still limited to quite an extent. So what are your thoughts on brands saying that, because you'll see it on social media, a lot of brands, make these claims saying that, can be used during pregnancy. I'd love to know your thoughts on that.
So I don't think there's enough data to say definitively yes or no, because it is such a new ingredient. I think there's limited studies on non-pregnant people, on the general population, let alone pregnant people. And I think doing studies on pregnant people has a whole other host of ethical and medical legal issues surrounding it. So that's probably why many people don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. I'm not really sure because it is a new molecule. I think there's that question because people want to market it, I'm sure, as the retinoid alternative during pregnancy, but I just don't think there's enough data to definitively say that it's safe or not safe. I wish I had. I looked a few months ago and I couldn't really find anything. And I don't really think that's changed unless anybody else has any other thoughts on that. But it is a different molecule. And again, cutaneous absorption is very, very minimal. So typically, for products that are used for a limited area on your face, if your barrier is not extremely compromised, it's probably very limited risk. But again, and it's interesting, if you think about the FDA, how they've changed the regulations in terms of labeling pregnancy safe and not. It used to have the pregnancy category A, B, C, D, X, but it's really, that was not a great way to label it because it's not black and white. And so they're now changing the package inserts to really have all the studies that we have there. So the consumer can really make an educated decision in discussion with their provider. Well, this is the data out there because we've not done direct clinical studies on pregnant women. What is the effect on pregnant mice, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it really is a gray area in general. And so, yeah, I wish I had something more definitive, but I think, I don't think there's anything great out there to say you can.
Now, moving on to formulation. When it comes to cosmetics approved retinoid ingredients, what are some of the challenges or hurdles to overcome when it comes to formulating with these ingredients? And this question will be directed to Ralph and Lalita. Ralph, do you want to maybe kick this one off?
Sure. I think one of the challenges of working with these molecules is that they are sensitive. They can be oxidized, they can be exposed to light and photoisomerize. So there's things that you need to watch out for when you're formulating with it. Some of the technology that we worked with where you're entrapping the actives in a delivery system can help prevent or minimize those kind of dangers from taking place, but nevertheless, still to get the best quality product. And we were talking earlier about doing well-established products that have good safety and good stability in them. You really need to be able to establish that if you're trying to work with a molecule and actually deliver that effectively to the consumer. So you do have to watch out with how you formulate the product, making sure you keep it away from oxygen as much as you possibly can, keeping it away from light during the formulation process, and then putting it into the proper packaging as well, so that it's going to have a full shelf life and it's going to be stable over that period of time, and really demonstrating that as well as part of your development. And so again, some different ways of doing that, formulations or through other technologies can really help to improve that and make it a little easier to work with these products.
Lalita, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, and to just add to that, I know, well, like Ralph said, pH is very important to ensure that the retinoid is compatible in the environment that it's in. And also a lot of the times you could use oil and water soluble antioxidants to help with the stability of the retinoid. I know that a lot of formulators use tocopherol as an antioxidant with the retinol, with any type of retinoids that they use. Also watching out for the regulatory limits and making sure that you are within that regulatory limit that you're, let's say you're working with a supplier and the supplier has their use level, making sure you're within that. And this, of course, depends on different regions. Some different regions have different regulatory limits, but I think it's important to stay within that. I know that, when I worked for a really big beauty conglomerate, we would fill our bottles under nitrogen blanket, right? So that basically means that there's a continuous flow of nitrogen gas right above the vapor space of your bottles, which removes any trace of oxygen. And that was really cool because that made it easy to ensure that your bottles don't have any oxygen getting into them. But of course, not every brand has the resources to have a nitrogen blanket in their lab or facility. And so these are some of the other things that Ralph mentioned that you can look for: pH, antioxidants. And like I mentioned before, doing stability testing, I think before you put your product in the market, ensuring you do stability testing to make sure that, within the different storage conditions, really hot, really cold, really humid, your product stays just as it is and you don't see any changes in odor or texture, color, consistency, whatever it is. You make sure that your product integrity is the same. So stability testing is something that I take very seriously, and I think a lot of brands and manufacturers do as well, to make sure that your product maintains that shelf life once it's opened.
Now, we had a few questions along these lines with respect to formulation and the development of products. So the first one was, how can you test the stability of a retinoid or a retinol in a product, or retinol, past normal product testing? For example, how can you test how much retinol is left after a certain period of time?
So it's typically what you can do with any kind of stability testing. So we'll often use accelerated testing. So 40 degrees C for a 3 or 6 month period of time, which is really kind of established with drug products too. So we treat retinol much like you would an actual API, an active pharmaceutical intermediate material. And so we try to make sure that we characterize it. We use HPLC to characterize the stability of the active. You can also do things like point of use testing, where you express some of the product out of the packaging over a period of time like a consumer would do, and then make sure that the retinol is still going to be there throughout the lifetime when the consumer is using the product, and exposing it to conditions that it could be exposed to as well during that period of times. So all those things can really help you make sure that you're going to have a good, robust product, besides the typical things that you do to make sure your product formulation is stable and is not falling apart and is going to be there for the long term for the consumer, whether it's freezing conditions or higher temperatures. All those kind of things are the things that you typically do, anyone does when they're developing a formulation. But then with retinol, you add in the additional ability to be able to really characterize it and make sure you understand its concentration over a period of time.
And then the next question along these lines, is retinol most effective in an oil or cream form? Are there any specific formulation types that these ingredients are most effective in? Why or why not?
I would say, again, it really depends on the formulation, texture, and consistency of that product. Retinols are mostly emulsions, and I personally prefer it in a cream form, because in a cream form, I find it, like, especially when you have like a lot of hydrating ingredients like hyaluronic acid, panthenol, allantoin, and glycerin, it really helps mitigate that risk for irritation. But again, that's just my personal preference. But there's some people that like a more oily consistency. But so I think it really is personal preference. But I think in both forms, whether you want to even do like a serum or a cream or an oil, I think as long as it's, has ingredients that can suit your skin type and your skin barrier, I think that's generally what I would recommend.
Okay, so now we've kind of talked about this already, but with respect to retinol and retinal, based on the research out there, what are some of the things that people can expect from these ingredients in cosmetic products? Aegean, you already talked about this with respect to like collagen production or things like that. So what can we expect from these products? And obviously it's going to be formulation dependent, and perhaps you can touch on that as well. Does anyone want to go first with this question? Maybe Aegean?
Sure. Just from a clinical perspective, I think definitely texture is going to be, you're going to see a big improvement with both of these products. From what I've read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that the retinal is more stable than the retinol. So I think definitely formulation has a big part to play in what effect you're going to see from which product. But in terms of both of these, you should see improvement in texture. It can help with acne, so just smoothing the complexion if you do have some blemishes. Definitely regulating that cell turnover and regulating how many keratinocytes are in those follicles will improve acne. And because of that improvement in collagen and elastin, you're going to have kind of an increase of, slight increase of volume almost. You can think of like a kind of a pillow that's been slept on for 6 months versus a fresh one from the factory. I think that's a good visual analogy. You'll get a little bit of plumpness, improvement in texture. It can help a little bit with pigmentation because of that exfoliation action, some lightening, but usually if you're treating an actual hyperpigmentary disorder, you do want to be using another lightening agent as well, but it can enhance the outcome. So those are the main clinical endpoints you should be looking out for. And then again, if you are using a product for about 3 months and you feel like you're plateauing, you're not seeing improvement in the areas that you want to see improvement on, you may need to switch your product. That's when I usually talk to my patients about what prescription options are out there, plus other sort of in-office procedures as well.
I think just to add to that as well, I've seen from a product development side, I've seen that retinaldehyde is more of a recent usage in cosmetics. Retinol has been around for a much longer period of time. And I do remember when retinaldehyde came about, we still, I think, only have about 1 or 2 suppliers that supply retinaldehyde. And so, the challenge for a lot of smaller brands is, well, can they source the retinaldehyde and things like price per kg, et cetera, MOQs, and that's just from a product development side. So I think that, hopefully down the road, we do see more products with retinaldehyde. I believe now that we have such great technology, like Ralph, when you go into retinaldehyde and how it's made, et cetera, we have found ways to stabilize retinaldehyde. And of course, retinaldehyde is, its metabolic distance to retinoic acid, it's 1 step closer. So it just needs that 1 step conversion to its bioavailable form, retinoic acid, versus retinol, the metabolic distance to retinoic acid, it's further. But that being said, I know people who prefer retinols over retinaldehydes, and I know people who prefers retinaldehydes over retinol. So again, it's really dependent on what you like and you prefer. But I do think that right now, where we stand in the beauty industry, we see more brands coming out with retinols versus retinaldehyde. And hopefully, down the road, we see more retinaldehydes as well.
Yeah, I think that's really kind of what is coming out new in this retinoid field is the retinaldehyde and the ability to use that molecule. You're right, it hasn't been as available in the marketplace. Commercial forms of retinol have been out there for some time. So that's why it's exciting to help in this development of this product. and being able to bring it into the marketplace with some of the delivery system technology that we're using to be able to bring it into a formulation and make it easy to formulate with at the same time. I think it does show a little bit better stability in the formulation, so that's always a good thing to have as well in any kind of product development when you're doing this. So we're pretty excited about that and glad to see that we can see this opportunity to be able to utilize this molecule and create some other excitement within the marketplace. People have been using retinol for a long time. I think they really trust it because it really has been out there, and the dermatology community has done a lot of studies to be able to show that this molecule really does work. So retinaldehyde is really part of that. It also really works. There's not as many studies out there, but basically because of the mechanism of how it works in the skin, it's really pretty well established as well, that it's going to have the same or even maybe better efficacy than retinol, depending on how it's put into a formulation.
Now, loosely along these lines, another question we got in the chat that I thought would be a good place to add here was, how much of a difference does encapsulation make versus using the free form of these ingredients? Are there real advantages? And maybe also, are there disadvantages? What do you guys think? And Ralph, do you want to answer this one?
Sure, I'll start off and then we can get the perspective of the others on the panel as well. One of the big benefits that encapsulations or delivery systems can offer is the ability to help reduce irritation. One of the key issues around all retinoids really is the fact that they can be irritating to the skin. It's not everyone doesn't feel it, so it depends on your skin type. And so some consumers just want to be able to keep on using the product, as Aegean was saying, that you really need to keep on using it for a period of time to get that. And they want to do that because of the irritation. They'll say it's not worth it. I'm not going to get past this point. So delivery systems can often provide that great benefit of being able to provide a sustained release of retinol, which has the benefit of reducing that irritation. So we've run cumulative irritation studies where we look at volunteer panelists who put the product on their back and then just look at the irritation potential. And you can see very big differences between free retinol, which means it's just dispersed into the formulation, and that's what's put into a delivery system. So that's a big benefit, extended release, lower irritation that can come out with some of the delivery systems. Not all of them are going to be like that. Some are more like a true encapsulation where there's a burst of the material. And so once it breaks on the skin, you'll still get kind of a immediate release of the active. So one of the questions, of course, then is, okay, if you're getting this slow down release, are you still going to get efficacy? So that's where you need to do clinical studies to be able to show that it still is effective and that you're going to get to the endpoint that you're looking for as well. So if you combine those things all together, it can make a very compelling story. And these delivery systems are well established. They have been used for a number of years. One of the leading tretinoin brands on the marketplace, which is used as a prescription acne product, is based on a delivery system technology that helped minimize the irritation of those products. So the concept's not new, it's been out there, and we're kind of always excited to be able to bring that forward and help with some of these challenges that retinoids can have.
Yeah, I think, just to add to that, totally agree that, the delivery system and, it enables a more sustained release of retinol. I guess even, I was reading a while ago about how the inspiration was tretinoin and micronized tretinoin. And, that's when it all started, that there is a way to decrease the level of irritation by, encapsulating it. Even benzoyl peroxide had we have the technology to entrap benzoyl peroxide, in a formulation that does reduce its side effects with irritation, because as you know, benzoyl peroxide is also known to be irritating. So I agree with Ralph, the concept is not new, but I think it's we've been seeing it in cosmetics. And I think it's nice because it does reduce that level of irritation while being able to maintain that efficacy. And with that, you can make sure you're, it stays stable within the formulation during its shelf life. You could also add other ingredients in there while ensuring that your retinaldehyde, or any type of encapsulated retinoid doesn't degrade within the formulation.
So now, are there any downsides to encapsulating these ingredients? And perhaps this is a misconception that I've seen online, that encapsulation will reduce the efficacy of the products. Obviously, like if something's irritating, then that's gonna like impact efficacy, but what do you guys think?
Yeah, I would say from what we've been able to do, that we can show that we still get a good release of the active onto the skin, and so we haven't seen that. It's hard though. I mean, you would really need to have to do a really well-controlled clinical study and looking at the retinol penetration in the skin and long-term depth to be really absolutely clear about that. But in the studies that we've seen, you really can see still very good efficacy, similar to the active by itself. So I think it is pretty well established that you can get the efficacy still with using an encapsulated material.
So now, Aegean, we've already covered this, but maybe you have something to add for this question. Are there any skin-related considerations from a dermatological perspective when using retinoids, from the cosmetic approved retinoids to the ones that would be seen in prescription topicals?
So I would say kind of the boogeyman of using retinoids is the purge. I think that everybody has kind of heard of this. It, I think, is one of the things that kind of scares people away from using it. And if you look online, you'd think it's much more common than it actually is. So I would say in my clinic, so the purge, for anybody that's not familiar, is an increase of acne lesions while you initially start using retinoids. And this is a phenomenon that I think really is talked about a lot online, but is not that common. So I would say this is my own clinical experience, about 20, maybe 30% of people experience an increase of acne lesions when they first start using retinoids, usually like 2 to 3 weeks, and then it resolves after a few weeks. And that's because you have kind of microscopic comedones you're not seeing, and then when you have an increased cell turnover, you get more acne lesions. So I think that's a big misconception and something to tell people about when they start it, because that might be a turnoff and they may stop. Well, this is making my acne worse. Why would I keep using it? And then I think the other piece, which we've already kind of touched on, is this debate between OTC retinols and other retinoid products versus prescription strength. And, for me as a dermatologist, I think it's important to kind of look at both of them as tools in our toolbox. I think there's more data coming out. Again, there may not be as much of a clinical difference between the different products, especially with all this new technology. Back in the day when things were less stable, over-the-counter products, probably weren't performing as well. But there's a lot of, more controlled studies that are showing that's not necessarily the case. So I think, from a dermatologist perspective, I think in terms of talking about efficacy and tolerability and trying to balance those two things, having options for our patients is really, really wonderful, that I can actually point to something that they can get from the drugstore, for at a pretty reasonable price point and still get really nice clinical results. And then in terms of, the cost as well, there's some other kind of cosmeceutical products that kind of push the $150, $200 range. And at that point, from a dermatologist perspective, I almost think that a patient would get a better bang for their buck having a physician consultation in addition with their prescription, and kind of having almost like a retinoid guide to kind of help them kind of gauge, well, what are you actually trying to address? Which product is right for you? So I think there's definitely positives and negatives to both things. But those are just things that kind of come to mind when I think of, trying to choose between the two. But I think ultimately, if you're kind of a newbie to retinoids, trying, kind of a lower cost, nicely formulated cosmetic retinoid product, I think, is a really good place to start, at least for a few months, and then kind of working your way up from there. And then the other thing that I made a note of is retinoids around the eyes. This is something that kind of comes up online a lot. There's camps that say, no, absolutely not. And then others that say it is fine. So I'm kind of in the it is fine category. as long as you're careful to not actually get it in the eye, it really does benefit the thinner skin around the eye to increase that collagen and elastin, especially if you have some actinic damage in that area. Yeah, so those are kind of things that come off top of mind as well. There's a lot of kind of rules out there, but I think, again, it's very patient dependent. So if you're not irritated and you can tolerate it and are seeing results, I think you can continue whatever you're doing.
Okay, so now I'm going to lump the final two questions that I had for all of you into one question because I see in the chat we have almost 50 questions from the audience. So we're going to try to answer as many as we can, but I have a feeling we're going to need a bit more time. So this question is going to be directed to Ralph. So what's the difference between, and we have already kind of talked about this, but between retinol and retinol? So what are the differences there? And then with respect to the development of retinol, what's the potential impact on the retinoid space for what products may be able to offer consumers? And also, why is it exciting that there's been so much development within the retinoid space in like retinols?
Yeah, so I think there really is this whole process where if you look at the whole retinoids that we're talking about for cosmetic applications, you can start out, people probably started out with retinol palmitate because it was a known version of vitamin A. They put it into the formulation. It was very stable, so it was easy to formulate with. And then came around to realize that that's probably the most difficult one to get any kind of efficacy. There's some indications where it hardly gets converted into the skin at all, because if you look at it, what has to happen, first you have to cleave apart the ester that produces retinol. Retinol then goes to retinaldehyde or retinal, and then that goes to retinoic acid, does the activity in the skin. So you're many steps away from being able to make that. That's not just a simple step-to-step process, because it's an equilibrium in the skin. Retinol can get converted back into an ester in the skin. It can go down to retinaldehyde, but can also get converted back to retinol. And so you have this complicated equilibrium that's taking place in the skin. So the excitement about retinaldehyde and making that more available, as Lalita mentioned earlier, is that it's one step closer to getting to the active form that you're really interested in. And so to have that readily available, some proof that you might be able to get better efficacy is really kind of an exciting thing, which I think is driving that, to be able to have a new part in the conversation where you can talk about this potential this new molecule, which is really going to be able to help you get perhaps better efficacy. All that has to be proven out in clinicals. We have a study that we're starting to do right now to directly compare retinol to retinaldehyde and see if we can see any differences in a well-controlled formulation with a placebo double-blinded study to be able to see, can we see anything there? So we're really excited to see if we're going to be able to show some benefit in that study. So stay tuned. We'll be able to talk about that next time.
Okay, so now on to your questions in the chat. This first question I will direct to Lalita. So what's the pH required in formulation when working with retinoids to keep them stable? Is there like a very specific pH that you need to be targeting?
In general, between 5.5 to 7, I would say is the normal pH that the retinoid works, has its optimal effectiveness in. But like Ralph had mentioned earlier, you can have a lower pH, but that really depends on the formulation. Is the retinaldehyde encapsulated perhaps, or the retinol encapsulated perhaps? At that point, you could perhaps the finished product could be at a lower pH. But in general, to answer your question, I would say between 5.5 to 7. That's the guidelines that I follow when I formulate. That would be my answer to that.
And now kind of along these lines, I would say is it possible for retinoids to work well with vitamin C? So let's maybe, I'm going to assume that they mean in the same formulation. So maybe we should ask the question of like, are they talking about ascorbic acid or vitamin C derivatives that might be able to be at a higher pH? Ralph, do you want to answer this one?
Yeah, we have looked at formulas where people tried to put, say, ascorbic acid directly with a retinol in a similar phase, like an anhydrous formulation, and you can see the retinol degrade just on mixing. So that's because ascorbic acid is an acid, so it has a very low pH, so that will degrade. So if you neutralize that ascorbic acid or you use one of the derivatives, it's very possible to put the two of them together. You still have to answer the question, are you getting all the benefits of that vitamin C derivative as well? So it's possible to put them together, and especially if you are very careful about the formulation type, but you do have to make sure that you are thinking about the pH that the product is going to be at. Otherwise, you will degrade the retinol.
And now this question is for Aegean. If retinol and retinoids increase cellular turnover in skin, is there a concern that long-term your skin will look worse, i.e. telomeres shorten and cells die, leaving skin worse off? What do you think?
I've seen this floating around the internet. I've had people comment on that before, and I've not seen any data for that. I think I don't know the long-term activity on the actual basal cells. So if you look at the epidermis as a whole, the basal cells have specific stem cells that are responsible for skin turnover. And I've not seen any evidence that using retinoids has an adverse effect on the population of those basal stem cells that would affect skin turnover. I've only seen positive long-term benefits, skin thickening, as well as collagen and elastin improvement. So I think sometimes biology can be a little bit counterintuitive, and there's lots of things that we don't know exactly why.
And then this next question will be for Ralph and Lalita, or maybe one of you, if one of you answers the question and there's nothing else to add. How do you reduce the irritation of retinoids in formulation? And we have kind of talked about this already, but do you guys have anything to add from what we've already discussed?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the most common ways to reduce irritation is to incorporate whether it's skin barrier enhancing ingredients like niacinamide, along with hydrating ingredients. And there's so many like glycerin, hyaluronic acid, panthenol, allantoin, and a whole bunch of other humectants and emollients that can really help subside the irritation.
And certainly delivery systems can help in that regard too, as we discussed earlier. So it's a great way to be able to help minimize the irritation of the retinoids and make sure that you don't have the problems that some consumers can see.
And then another question. Retinol comes with BHT, BHA, and PEGs, which aren't allowed in the EU. Any suggestions? Now, to my understanding, that's not correct, but I don't have the causing database in front of me to check for myself. And perhaps if people are curious for what's banned and not banned, you can refer to the causing database and see for yourself. But maybe I'm wrong because I don't have it in front of me. So Ralph, can you answer us here?
Yeah, what they're talking about really is the form that the retinol comes in. No one buys retinol as a crystalline material and puts it into their formulation as the pure material. It always comes in some sort of carrier. One of the most popular carriers that has been on the market for a long time is polysorbate 20, with this an ethoxylated carrier for this. And the typical stabilizer that has been used in that was BHT and BHA. Both with have problematic. BHT, certainly in the European marketplace right now, is coming under regulatory concern, and BHA is on the Prop 65 list as well. But there are versions of those products that are only stabilized with tocopherol that are very good. And there's also versions of these carriers that don't have polysorbate 20 in them or other ethoxylated materials as well. So we make some products that are like that, that can fit these, check off these boxes of being able to make sure that they're going to be best to use across the regulatory markets. But that's something that's ever changing, right? Because just a couple of years ago, BHT wasn't really on everybody's list, but now it is. And ethoxylation has been a concern for a number of years. So it's a world that we live in terms of a better understanding of where concerns are. So we as suppliers into the industry and formulators into the marketplace always have to be aware of that and looking for ways in which we can create better comfort for the consumers with the products that we offer them.
Same with PEGs, I guess. I've seen that there's a lot of fear around its, does it actually increase irritation or is it toxic in any way or form? And so a lot of brands want to formulate their products without PEGs. But the reality is that, PEGs have been used in cosmetics for a very long time. They are great thickeners, solvents, for moisturizing purposes, and they have so many different functions that I know, like Ralph said, it's a world we're living in today. I think a lot of the times misinformation we see from different organizations when they put out studies, unfortunately, with animal models and extrapolate that onto human skin. And, we can't really make that connection on, well, if PEGs are harmful in like one type of species, is it going to translate to humans? And so I think in my opinion is that PEGs are totally safe and fine. And I've used it in formulation, but I do see a trend of, brands wanting to formulate their products without PEGs and, BHT and BHA as well. So, yeah.
And now, Aegean, you've already kind of talked about this, but we had a specific question, so I'll ask it just to clear the air, just in case anyone is still confused about this. So what do you think about using tretinoin and maybe also retinol around the eye area for photo damage? Or is it damaging and irritating to the area around the eye, and that's something that we shouldn't do? Can it like make your under eye area look worse at the end of the day because of the irritation? What do you think? And also, if it does, is that long term, or do you just have to stick with it?
So I would say everybody is different. So the eye area is notoriously thin. So the skin is very thin, very, very susceptible to irritant reactions as well as allergic contact reactions. So I would say whichever retinoid product you're using, use it carefully around the eye area. Do not get it into your actual eye conjunctival mucosa. But if you're using it on the skin around the eye and you're experiencing any irritation at all, I would recommend stopping that. I know there are specially formulated eye creams with retinoid molecules in them, and that may be another direction to go. I would say for most people that don't have overly sensitive skin, can tolerate having retinoids around the eye area. And you can always do a small patch test. You don't have to slather a lot on. You can use just a little bit, one pinpoint spot and do that for a week and see if you notice any irritation. Or, there's a lot of ways that, aside from formulation, that you can kind of play around and kind of assess your tolerability. If you can only tolerate using your retinoid every other night, you're still going to get efficacy from that. I prefer using a stronger retinoid molecule. I personally use Tazarac twice a week. And for me, I found that that's given me the best results. Some people find that they'll have a better result. They can use a retinol daily. So, kind of getting back to the eye thing, it really just depends on your tolerability. I have not seen any data that it can cause a long-term worsening of the skin texture. If you're having edema, especially in the lower eye, irritation, especially in the lower eye, anytime you have irritation and inflammation in the skin, fluid comes along with it. So you may experience some short-term swelling and it may look worse, but that should resolve. But again, it just depends on the person. And, if you ever have any questions, I feel like having a dermatologist working with you as you're going along your retinoid journey is probably a smart thing to do.
And now, along the lines of product testing, how can we as consumers know that companies have performed all the necessary stability tests for retinoid products? Lalita, would you like to start this one?
I guess consumers could always ask the brand. I know that, being on the brand side, I've seen consumers message either email or Instagram or whatever and try to figure out, well, what are the tests that you have done to ensure that this is stable and this is safe for me to use. So I think, some brands may respond, some brands may not respond. I think this really depends on the size of the brand, how receptive they are to their consumers. But I think the first thing that I always suggest is you can always reach out to brands. I mean, I've personally reached out to brands and asked them questions about formulation or whatever it is. And, sometimes I hear back, sometimes I don't, and that's okay. So I would say reach out and ask.
Okay, Ralph, do you have anything to add before I ask my next question?
Yeah, I mean, it is really who you trust and
Yeah.
do you feel that they're bringing to market an honest product and they're really bringing you good information. So I think as a consumer uses the product and understands the company themselves, they can probably tell a little bit about the quality. But I think, as Lalita mentioned, you can always reach out and ask them about it, because how they respond to that probably will tell you a lot about them as well. How they're willing to engage with their consumers and be able to show, yeah, we're making a good product and do all these things to make sure that it's going to work for you.
Yeah, because often if companies have the data, they're generally happy to share it because that data was pretty dang expensive. So now this next question is directed again to Ralph and Lalita. So what are the reasons, and we've kind of talked about this, but what are the reasons why there aren't many retinaldehyde raw material manufacturers out there? And will retinaldehyde be the new retinol? Obviously, you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you think? Ralph, would you like to start this one?
Yeah, it's a good question. Why it hasn't been looked at as much in the marketplace. Likely it's just been more of a historical thing that retinol was the first molecule that came in the marketplace. There were a number of commercial ways to be able to obtain that, and retinaldehyde just hasn't been as common. So I think as people start bringing it out into the marketplace and different formats and making it easier to formulate with, I can see that there's going to be more interest in this and creating excitement about being able to bring this molecule into the marketplace.
Lalita, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, agree with everything that Ralph said. It's definitely a newer, in cosmetics, at least, it's a newer invention. And perhaps it was trying to figure out how to do the whole encapsulation process. I don't know, Ralph, if that was, something that you spent a lot of time on, but, perhaps I think, like Ralph said, I agree that retinols have been like the mainstream so far, but moving forward, I don't really know why retinaldehydes have not been in the market, but I'm just glad that they are here and that moving forward, we do see a lot of brands using them.
And then another formulation related question, and one more before I switch back to the dermatological questions for Aegean. So this question was, can you formulate retinoids into alternative forms, for example, powders and stick products?
Yeah,
Ralph, would you like to start?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, that can be a challenge for many of the retinols are in. So if you buy one that's in a polysorbate 20 matrix, you might be limited to what other forms you can bring that into. It's certainly one of the advantages that a delivery system approach can make. In our particular case, they're provided as a powder. So any format that you can put a powder into, you can typically be able to put our technology into. And that could be the same for some other products that are on the market as well. So I think that does give you formulation flexibility in terms of being able to say, I want to put this into, say, a stick format where it's hydrophobic and it might be difficult to bring it into, or if you wanted to bring it into a powdered format as well, that's something else that you can do. So there's no inherent reason why you can't formulate in those particular environments, as long as you're careful about all the other things that we talked about earlier, and making sure you have a good quality manufacturing techniques and good packaging for your product. You can use all these different alternate formats.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Ralph said. I think we are seeing brands coming out with more innovative forms like retinol sticks, et cetera. So that technology does seem to be evolving, but I still think the mainstream seems to be creams, gels, serums, et cetera. But, it's kind of nice to see these different formats like stick format, et cetera. It's just being able to work with a manufacturer or a formulator that knows how to get that retinoid stabilized into like a stick format, et cetera. So, yeah.
Now, this question was directed to Aegean. So this commenter has been using prescription tretinoin for about 1.5 years, and now they experience, redness and tenderness on their skin, especially when working out. Could this be due to very deep penetration? Can tretinoin penetrate too much? Any
So
thoughts?
I think that there could be a variety of things going on. I would definitely look into what other products you're using at the same time, and what other factors could be affecting your skin barrier. So, introduction of new products, the weather change. So I know for myself and many of my patients during winter, when the humidity is very low, the air is much more dry, people are not able to tolerate the retinoid at the same level that they were able to use during the summer. So I actually usually recommend people reduce their retinoid frequency during winter if they're noticing increased irritation. So there's a number of things that can cause that. In terms of, too much penetration, I will say if your barrier is compromised, you can experience more absorption. And because of that more absorption, you are getting more of that effect of that retinoic acid, and then more irritation, more scaling, more flaking, and potential redness. So, that's why, if somebody's having issues tolerating their retinoid, recommending waiting for the skin to dry, because, moist skin definitely absorbs more product. Sometimes we recommend patients do short contact. So just leaving it on for maybe a few minutes and then rinsing it off, so they're not getting those adverse effects, or even putting it on top of moisturizer. So your skin already has a little bit of a barrier cream on it, and that can reduce some absorption. So, there may be other things going on.
And now I think you may have answered this question in your last answer here, but if another product has caused irritation, is it better to temporarily stop using retinoids?
Yes, I would say anytime you're experiencing redness, irritation, a tight feeling, a stinging feeling from products that don't normally give you a stinging feeling, I recommend kind of a fast from all active products, just because you don't know what's leading to, an impaired skin barrier. Even things that are generally thought of as pretty inert, like vitamin C products or even niacinamide, can be potentially irritating to somebody that's experiencing some sort of barrier defect. So I usually advocate for complete gentle skincare using a gentle cleanser, and then a moisturizer with a lot of humectants and emollients, ceramides, just to help support your skin as it kind of restores the skin barrier.
Now, this next question was regarding retinol and retinol percentages and formulations on the market. And obviously it's going to vary from market to market, but what are the highest levels of retinol in products on the market?
Or,
Go on.
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I guess it really depends on the region. Like you said, Jen, I've seen, at least in the US, you can use 0.25, 0.5, 1% retinol. In terms of retinaldehyde, I'm not entirely sure what the upper limit is, but I've seen 0.1 retinaldehyde used as probably the maximum concentration, at least from the brands that I've worked with in the past. I've seen 0.1 retinaldehyde, but again, this is US only. It can vary region to region. Ralph, you may want to chime in for what is the upper limit of retinaldehyde?
Yeah, I don't really, I think because again, it's relatively new to the marketplace. I don't think people have explored early on in the history of retinols. They were probably at 0.1% was the maximum concentration. And then we started to see the higher concentrations, 0.5, 1%, even some products that are out above 1% retinol. So I think we'll probably see that with retinaldehyde as well. There's some indication that it may be less irritating than retinol, which is considerably less irritating than retinoic acid. I think all of this is, though, it's what is your tolerance? And so some people are going to be able to tolerate those high levels of retinol. And the concern, of course, is if you're not careful, someone will try to use a 1% because they think I'm going to get that benefit. I'm going to get it quick. And this is going to be a great way for me to get instant anti-aging. And that's really dangerous. I think so. Anyone who's going to start out, you really want to start out with a lower concentration and build up based on your tolerance and really kind of carefully monitor it and see where we can go. Branders and marketers of products can be pretty excited to jump that level up to the highest amount. And that can be great because some people might really be able to benefit, but the consumer has to be aware and make sure that they understand what's going on and what the risks are for them.
So more isn't always better. A common misconception online, I think, stemming from the arms race for higher percentages in formulation. So just so you know. Okay, so this next question, a controversial question, but if you'd like to answer, you can. Lalita, maybe I'll put you on the spot if you want to answer first. Is The Ordinary a good brand for retinols? And is price indicative of effectiveness?
Personally, I mean, I can only say what I personally feel about The Ordinary. I do like The Ordinary. I think one big reason I like them is because they've introduced a lot of education behind their products. I think through The Ordinary, we have learned a lot more about, you know, what's niacinamide, what's glycolic acid, what's lactic acid, etc. Your formulations are fairly simple, but that's okay. I think I think that's fine. You know, a lot of them. I know that there's so many people that wonder if, like, because it's so cheap, is it even effective? And I think that is like, you know, well, the brand, what did the brand decide its profit margins are going to be? I mean, different brands have different ideas of, you know, what they want to market up, right? So I think in that sense, The Ordinary, you know, it's cheap, but it's still effective in my opinion. I like that they offer, I like that you can kind of use what you want. Like if you want to just use a niacinamide serum, you could use that. Or if you just want to use, I don't know entirely all their products, I can't remember, but if you just want to use lactic acid, you can just use that. So you can kind of test out what your skin likes, what your skin doesn't like. And overall, I think they're a good brand.
Does anyone want to chime in or leave it there and move on to the next question?
I mean, I'll second what Lalita is saying from a kind of a consumer point of view. I love that you can kind of mix and match. Like when I was pregnant, I just used their lactic acid products. You know, I knew it was a 5% product, and it was just kind of, I think as a consumer, it can be sometimes confusing trying to sort out between branding, well, what's actually in this product? So for me as a dermatologist, I like it. It's just very clear, you know, this is an azelaic acid product. This is, you know, this is lactic acid, and being able to pick and choose from that, I think is great. And having such a great price point, you don't have to break the bank to try different active ingredients, because I think for a lot of the other kind of higher end products, there is a big barrier to entry. And, you know, people sometimes will end up spending a lot of money, you know, on products that may not necessarily give them the benefit that they're looking for.
And another question, loosely related to, I suppose, The Ordinary, because they do have a product with the ingredient. Is Granactive Retinoid as effective as retinol? I'm not sure if this is how it's marketed to consumers. What's the level of evidence behind this ingredient and some of the other alternative retinoids out there?
Yeah, so I think, you know, hydroxypinocolone retinoid, the chemical name, it's an ester form of all trans retinoic acid. So essentially, the mechanism is such that it doesn't need any conversion. It binds directly to the retinoic acid receptors. And at least the manufacturer studies say that it's not as irritating as retinols or retinaldehyde. Again, that's very limited studies, but there, a lot of people do like Granactive retinoids and find that it's a lot more gentle on their skin. But there's this other side where, Jen, I'm sure you can comment on. Health Canada is putting it on their hot list very soon, which means they're going to ban that ingredient as a cosmetic because they feel like it has innate retinoic acid activity. So essentially it should be categorized as a drug and not a cosmetic. So I think there's some controversies around that ingredient, but within the US, you're allowed to sell that ingredient and have it in a product. In terms of effectiveness, a lot of people say that it's much less irritating, and that really depends on your skin type.
Okay, so I feel like now is a good time to wrap up this panel. So before I conclude the conversation, do each of you have any final take homes that you'd like to leave with our audience? Or maybe there is a point that wasn't covered, but you think is important to add in here? Ralph, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think what we're talking about is a really well-established area of cosmetic chemistry that's based on really good understanding of pharmaceutical and cosmetic and based on ingredients that have well-established clinical efficacy. So that's the retinols, the retinaldehyde, leading into retinoic acid, and I think the exciting thing is that these molecules have been on the marketplace for a long time, but what consumers really understand that they are effective. There's other things that people will look at and come on that could have great efficacy, but just haven't been as widely studied. So that creates the excitement about this, and the opportunity to bring out new molecules like retinaldehyde and make it easier to put into your formulation, I think creates some excitement around this area and kind of continuous revolution of these sort of molecules and their ability to be used across the formulation. So we're excited to be part of this and look forward to being able to continue to work and develop new opportunities within the space.
Lalita, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I think this was a really great discussion. And one thing that I always tell a lot of people is if you find a retinol product that you like and you see that it's giving you the results that you want, stick to it. Don't research too much into it if it's safe or it's not safe. I mean, every single brand out there has to follow guidelines to ensure that their product is safe for consumer use to be sold in the market. So, brands are doing the safety studies that they need to do to ensure the safety of retinols. I know the safety of retinols came up a lot in the chat as well. So I just wanted to reiterate that retinols are safe, and formulators, are doing a lot of research every day to ensure that they are bringing you, products that are effective in terms of retinoids. So if you have a product that you really like, continue using it and enjoy it too.
And last but not least, Aegean.
I will say just be patient. It is a holy grail ingredient for a reason, but stick with it. And even if maybe one formulation doesn't work for you, it's amazing how many options there are for people. So definitely it may include some trial and error, but it is really for me, in my opinion, if you're going to use one ingredient, a retinoid type molecule is really the best thing for you. You're going to see really great results. So like Ralph said, go slow and start low and build up as tolerated. Everybody's skin is different. And then the last thing is more expensive is not necessarily better.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for contributing to this conversation. I know I personally learned a lot listening to you guys. big thank you to Covelo for hosting this webinar and also having me as moderator. If you are not familiar with Covelo, again, they are a very large ingredient database where you can learn more about the different ingredients on the market, and the platform is free for ingredient suppliers. You can also think about showcasing your ingredients on their database. So if you're in the latter, reach out to them, but if you're in the former, then the accounts are free, so you might as well go check it out. This webinar, this panel, will be sent to your email, a replay. So if you'd like to rewatch, if you missed part of it, then stay tuned, it'll be sent to you. And this will also be available on other feeds shortly. Thank you again for watching. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for being so engaged in the comments. So many great questions. So thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.